Some reports have said that it's possible Japanese automaker Nissan has just about a year to survive.
They have a lot of debt. They have dwindling profits and cash.
Nissan is in panic mode, looking for somebody to save them.
Profits fell 90% in the first half of 2024.
Wow, that's really not good. Dropping profits by 90%, that's obviously almost 100%. That's really struggling. That's quite bad. I know we have covered quite a few automotive companies recently, but this definitely sounds like the worst. But it does seem like there's a lot of companies struggling in the automotive market. This could be based off of prices skyrocketing in COVID. And then as we saw with fast food and grocery prices, for instance, those prices stayed high after inflation and after COVID. Fast food, we're starting to see it drop down after those companies started to see customers pull back from shopping there and making purchases with them. This might be a similar thing going on with Nissan and some of those other automotive markets, which is they had their prices too high for too long. They didn't make the cars all that much better. And then you start to lose your customer base. And if that goes on for year after year, if there's nothing differentiating you from your competition, you're eventually going to fail.
From the same period the year prior. To ensure its survival, it is seeking an anchor investor. Nissan is in talks to merge with Japanese rival Honda.
A tie-up with Honda would be better than almost any other OEM that I can think of.
This is bigger than a merger between two companies that have to be Japanese. This is the end of an era, in a sense, where the Japanese find themselves under attack from an emergent and ascending Chinese auto industry.
Nissan's crisis is a dramatic reversal of the far healthier results seen at the end of the company's 2023 fiscal year. It has cut production, jobs, and executive salaries. Its problems aren't US specific. It's challenged in China, Europe, and emerging markets. Long overshadowed by Japan's leading names, it in recent years has suffered blow after blow. A longtime alliance with another automaker is strained. A once admired former CEO is an international fugitive. Once a leader in EVs, Nissan has been eclipsed.
So some of its electric vehicles that were pioneers got old and were not competitive enough, and then the Chinese arrive and change everything.
A new partnership.
I hope they elaborate more on the fugitive part. They sort of dropped that one and then kept going in their storyline here. So I'm hoping they circle back because that was definitely interesting news to drop in the middle of there. I haven't been following that closely, so it'd be curious to hear more about that situation.
With another automaker, even a Chinese one, might be its best shot.
These are desperate measures that demonstrate that they were not prepared for this new reality after pandemic and after the semiconductor shortage, which put the Chinese car makers almost at the top.
While the global auto industry's total sales grew by 2% in the first half of 2024, Nissan's fell by 1.6%. The company blamed its drop in operating income on fewer sales, greater sales incentives, and inflation.
It's been struggling in the market, it's been struggling at home, it doesn't have the right product lineup. There are so many warning signs, so many red flags around Nissan.
Like larger Japanese rivals Toyota and Honda, Nissan is a global automaker. The US is its largest market. Lately, China has yielded the biggest losses. In the first half of fiscal 2024, sales fell by more than 5%. From January to October of that year, that number was 10%. In October 2024, Nissan sold 61,170 units in China. In October 2017, it had sold 3 times that amount. But the US has been a declining market for the company too. Sales of the Nissan brand fell by 34% over the course of the pandemic.
Yeah, that's definitely not good. They have mentioned China quite a bit. Something that we have seen in other segments is, well, one, generally speaking, China likes to promote the companies within their country. And so this is true for things like their phone companies, their other tech companies, their automotive companies. They try to prevent competition from external sources, so that way they can kind of lift up and use their own technology, their own resources, and continue to develop. This is something that actually like Trump seems to be interested in doing himself for the US, which is adding more tariffs to external parties, promoting manufacturing, etc., within the country, and then hopefully this will increase the skill set here. But this also means that they're going to have more sales internally. So this is where, if that is true, what you would likely see in the US over the coming years is that American automotive companies would then gain share in the market at that time, and then foreign companies would lose share at that time. In addition to that, we've actually seen that China EV market, they're actually one of the leaders right now. They're obviously competing with Tesla, but they are very quickly gaining on Tesla at this point. And so there is certainly questions on whether or not they will surpass Tesla at some point for EV vehicles, especially just due to how cheap they are and how comparable they are, generally speaking. And so that is one of the aspects that China is really leading some of those newer EV automotive market spaces at the moment. And this is something that's been hurting a lot of other automotive brands, broadly speaking, especially as we pull back from standard oil consumption for global warming and climate reasons. This is where governments like the US are pushing towards diminishing those old energy sources and promoting greener energy sources.
Sales for Infiniti, Nissan's premium or luxury brand, fell by more than 55%. That's the worst performance.
Wow, that's actually really bad. So they're actually top two. They're number 1 and 3 for worst percent change in sales in the US. That's much worse. We've actually covered Stellantis previously, and so this is where it sounds very similar, but Nissan's is much worse in numbers compared to what we've covered for Stellantis in the past.
Of any brand in the US. Part of the problem is a product lineup that hasn't kept up with the times or is misaligned with the market.
Because they still have, in my opinion, product quality that's not as good as Honda or Toyota or Mazda or the Koreans. It doesn't have really innovative designs like we've come to expect from the Korean brands. And now I would say Toyota is having some more innovative styling. And it doesn't have the dealer network in the US where there's a lot of loyalty and trust and love that exists between the dealers and Nissan corporate.
Nissan plans to discontinue its Titan full-size pickup in North America. Pickups are a huge market and tend to be profitable. A recent attempt at a comeback for Infiniti.
So something that I want to cover, they just mentioned Toyota as an example. So for reference, I believe Toyota and Honda are generally known as the most reliable brands, and they're also quite affordable. And so generally speaking, like a Honda Civic is like the go-to affordable car that will be reliable for you, and it'll be easier to maintain because they're so prevalent, or like a Toyota Camry or Accord or something along those lines. And so they're known as being affordable and reliable at the same time, which makes them really strong in the market, especially right now where inflation is large and people are being more and more cost sensitive. And then this is where if you're not the most reliable or the cheapest option or the combination of those two factors, then you need to separate yourself from the competition with some distinguishing feature of some sort. And so this would be something along the lines of luxury of some sort, whether it's seating, maybe it's a luxury experience in driving, like how fast you can go or how smooth the ride is. Something needs to be unique about your vehicle. And this is where there's so many other automotive brands that exist today that trying to carve out a niche for yourself is really hard. They just mentioned trucks, for instance, and this is where other segments are much more reliable for trucks. Certainly in the US, Ford is known for trucks. I think GM is pretty popular. Even Toyota, I believe, has trucks that are relatively well liked in the market. And so this is where you only need so many brands competing in the same space to have a few options. Once it gets too far out of options, then you're just going to by default kind of drop them off. Because again, if you see most reviews, you often see some like best overall or best value, best for safety, for instance, or best performance, best miles per gallon. You'll have like a handful or so criteria. And if one car or automotive maker can be the best at 2 or 3 of those factors, then there's only really going to be like 3 or 4 brands and models that are up for debate in that segment. And so that's where you can't have dozens or multiple dozens of automotive makers all trying to compete in so many spaces without having a niche carved out for themselves. And this is generally true for any business. You need to make sure you have a niche. Otherwise, you're just going to get lost in the noise of, if nobody really loves you, then there's no reason for them to go buy from you in particular. And likely your customers are just going to move the next time they find something that they do love.
A large SUV was priced too high.
They've got a product that came out that dealers were excited about at first, and then they feel like it's overpriced. There's a lot of products you can buy for $100,000. You can buy a Range Rover for $100,000, or a Land Rover. You can buy, an Escalade. You can buy BMW. You can buy a Mercedes. There's a lot, and I don't think the Infiniti brand stands.
This is another good point, which is we were saying the same things with other brands that are struggling at this point in time, which is, again, as I mentioned previously, car and other markets, they just increased prices so rapidly during COVID and post-COVID. And this is where some automotive makers just thought, we can get away with this. They're not the only ones. This is effectively how capitalism works, which is supply and demand. When there's enough demand, like when there's a shortage of chips and there's not enough cars being made, then basically that means everybody's going to have to choose a car from one of the brands, whoever's available. And so this likely increased demand relative to supply during COVID. And so they just kept upping their prices, which is common. That's how capitalism works. And then now that there's more supply relative to demand, now people are starting to ask themselves, why would I get this car versus another car more strictly? And how are you going to differentiate yourself? I would agree with that point. Infiniti, I didn't even realize it was a Nissan brand. I'm not a huge car guy myself, but still, I had such little brand recognition of Infiniti. And as he mentioned, why wouldn't you get like a Mercedes-Benz or like a Rolls-Royce or a BMW or some other handful of luxury vehicles that exist if you're starting to get into those price points over, like, I think he said 100K here. And so this is where once you have a really expensive car, then you're going to start comparing it to other expensive cars. And if you're more in line with much cheaper cars, then there's no one who's going to be looking for you or your product. And again, this is true for any business. You need to make sure that you're priced appropriately for what you're delivering value to the customers, because customers are doing the same thing. They're trying to maximize their value for what they're paying for that product. And so they're going to find the best way to spend their dollars. And that will be true generally speaking. Obviously, there's going to be a few folks who just don't care. Maybe they're very brand loyal. Maybe they just need a car and that was just the closest dealership. But in large, this will generally be true, where customers will find where the best value is and try to maximize their dollars. And that's where you as a business owner need to make sure that you're fulfilling the various needs of the customer. And this is, again, where you've got to pick your niche, which is if you're looking for high-end pricing, then you need to be high-end for luxury and features. If you're looking at low-end, then that's not as important. But the worst combination is being luxury price with low-end quality and features. Nobody succeeds there at the long term. But this is where greed kind of comes into play. And another company who knew just did this, I think stands out to me, is McDonald's. McDonald's, obviously, there were so many videos of people like showing the like see-through patties because they were so thin, and prices were still increasing until they were like, I believe, about 100% increase from, I believe, about 2019, 2020 to now. And that's just absurd. So they're just lowering the quality of their product, increasing prices, and so many other companies hopped on the bandwagon because they were seeing their profit margins grow. And then a lot of companies who just took advantage of this and rested on their laurels are really starting to hurt nowadays.
Brands in the consumer's mind at the same level as those brands.
This is hardly the first time Nissan has been in trouble. Its last brush led to an alliance with French maker Renault in 1998, to which smaller Japanese maker Mitsubishi was later added. The following revival largely took place under the leadership of former CEO Carlos Ghosn, a Lebanese-Brazilian outsider. Ghosn became something of a legend in Japan before a spectacular downfall that ended with him escaping house arrest in a musical equipment case.
Former Nissan chairman Carlos Ghosn had been under house arrest in Japan. Now, Ghosn is no longer under house arrest. He's landed in Lebanon.
I'm glad that they're circling back to this. And also, it's interesting. They've already highlighted that he was in a musical case, which is pretty interesting. I'm going to try to go back to that. I think that was right here.
With him escaping house arrest in a musical equipment case.
That's pretty impressive. this individual, either these cases are really big or this individual is very flexible for whatever their age is. So I got to hand it to them. If they were willing to hide in one of these boxes to try to get out of the country, like, they sort of deserve to make it out of there. I don't know. That's my opinion. Share what your thoughts are, but this is dedication. He was making it out one way or the other in this musical case or some storage container, whatever it was going to be. But I think I can respect that personally, that he was really going to the extreme to try to get out as much as possible. I have no idea what he did, so I might regret those words in a moment, but I think at least his commitment to his own freedom is praiseworthy.
Former Nissan chairman Carlos Ghosn had been under house arrest in Japan. Now, Ghosn is no longer under house arrest. He's landed in Lebanon.
Nissan was still reeling from this episode in the years leading up to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Nissan was struggling before the pandemic hit.
Actually, I just keep coming back to this because now I'm just imagining he must have had somebody else helping him. Like, since this guy is super rich, somebody had to help him probably get the plane. Someone probably had to help him get, like, the music cases. And this dude looks kind of old. Like, he probably needed actual physical assistance getting into the case. So, anyway, that's interesting. And kudos also to the employee who did that. Hopefully you got a lot of money out of that situation. That seems like a high risk, high return scenario. So hopefully you milked that for whatever that was worth. Whoever key secretary or intern was there to help him into the box and also help him out of the box afterwards. But hopefully you got paid pretty well for that.
There was a lot of supply out there in the marketplace back then. If you look at the history of Nissan, it's always been the number 3 Japanese brand. Toyota, Honda, Nissan. Nissan's always been kind of the third, the Japanese stepchild in a way.
Renault would later reduce its stake in Nissan from 43% to 15%.
Yes, it's still an alliance. There are still partners, but as the word says, it's an alliance. So it's not a marriage. They are somehow together but separate. It worked under Carlos Ghosn because he was the only one who could make the Japanese French people work together, and probably it was also one of the reasons why he was sent out of the company, because he was trying to merge these companies.
The COVID years brought shortages, chips, raw materials, and of course, vehicles. Suddenly, every automaker was able to sell every vehicle it had for a strong price and a strong profit.
And then in the words of Warren Buffett, when the tide went out, you could see who was swimming naked.
In fiscal year 2023, Nissan sold 794,000 units in China. In its original 2024 forecast, the company estimated a 3% decline, but it revised its forecast down another 10%, and the outlook for every region is more pessimistic than its previous. Though it foresees improvement in North America, it is still a downward revision from its earlier target and not enough to offset losses elsewhere. While automakers were raking in cash in some markets, conditions in the world's largest were turning against them. Virtually every car maker faces an onslaught of highly competitive Chinese cars. 63% of the vehicles sold in China are made by domestic companies, a 27% increase since 2020. This has hit...
That was exactly what I was referencing earlier, which is China is definitely reinforcing Chinese-made products and goods within their own market. And so they have basically everybody who isn't a Chinese company is losing in China at this moment. That has generally been true historically, but they do seem to be really leaning in, especially in the automotive space, as they seem to be trying to potentially overtake maybe Tesla or other companies and become like the new standard brand, especially for EVs. But this is definitely a trend that we're seeing across the board.
Nissan especially hard.
Is 1/5 of their sales coming from a market that don't want to buy foreign car brands anymore. So you are, let's say, quite exposed to it, and the response has been quite low, as it has been the case for Volkswagen, for the German premiums, and even Toyota, Hyundai. All of the ones operating in China are taking longer to respond to this shift in demand in China.
It doesn't help that Nissan has fallen behind its non-Chinese competitors in the electrification race as well. Just over half the cars sold in China are electric or hybrid. Nissan was once a leader in this space. The Leaf, first released in 2010, is often called the world's first fully electric mass-market vehicle, but it has received fewer updates than competitors. In some markets, such as the US, Nissan doesn't have a hybrid. It will introduce a Rogue plug-in hybrid to its US lineup in 2025, as well as a replacement for the Leaf EV.
They had the vision, let's go electric. But what they didn't have was that special sauce called making their products attractive, alluring, good-looking, something that would move the emotions. This is what Tesla nailed, and this is what more Chinese automakers are getting on.
While its share in China plummets, it's also increasingly confronted with Chinese cars in other markets, especially in emerging ones, such as Thailand, Indonesia, countries in the Middle East and Africa, and Latin America. Individually, many of these markets are small, but altogether they make up about a fifth of global car sales and about 16% of Nissans. Some of the leading Chinese EV makers have a 30% cost advantage even without subsidies, and an ability to pump out new models in a year and a half, compared with more than 5 years for legacy automakers.
And the population in these economies, most of it cannot afford brand new cars, especially now when prices of cars have been increasing over the last 5 years. China is becoming like a solution for these people. That's where these brands, companies like Nissan, are feeling the impact.
BYD is the company that they referenced. They just showed a very quick clip of it. I believe that is the one that is the electric vehicle maker that is getting huge right now. I am actually glad that they've covered a variety of markets and how they're been impacting them. I know sometimes in the past they have covered China, and it was a little odd to me how they were covering China in those segments. It was almost like they were forcing China to be relevant at that point for that video. This one I think makes a lot of sense. Nissan is making a large portion of their revenue in China. They are hurting there. They were also a leader in EV back in the day, but have fallen off. And that 100% aligns with China and what they're doing, and how BYD, for instance, is coming up as one of the winners in recent years for the automotive space. And so this one feels a lot more natural. And so I appreciate the way that they're covering this. It seems like it's more fair and thorough in their coverage, and they're not just like tossing in random facts just to be like trendy or something like that.
Nissan's troubles in the US, its largest market, are entirely different. Many of its foreign rivals, including some fellow Japanese firms, are thriving here. The average US Nissan dealer is selling 400 fewer cars than it was 5 years ago. The average Mazda dealer is selling 266 more.
Since you can't see it, let me just move quickly. So basically the companies that are doing well at the moment are Mazda, Lexus, Kia, BMW. And so those are the ones that are winning at this point in time, whereas Infiniti, Nissan, Stellantis, JLR, not as much. Seems like Cadillac is mostly the same.
So it's not just a Japanese car maker thing. It's specific, I think, to Nissan, that some of the decisions they've made, the management choices they've made about the products they've produced, how they've interacted with their dealers, how they've interacted with consumers when there's a problem with the product, has led to this significant loss of market share in the US.
Take service, for example. Nissan sells a lot of cars with continuously variable transmissions, which have had some problems. Haig says the company has historically refused to pay to fix them if the car is out of warranty.
They fix it if it's under warranty, but if it's not, they're saying, it's the consumer's problem. Well, it also becomes the dealer's problem, because the customer comes back and says, hey, my vehicle's got 36,001 miles and the transmission is out. What can you do for me? The dealer calls Nissan, asks for help, and they say, well, it's out of warranty. And so the customer is on his own to fix that vehicle. And that's, four-figure repair.
Yeah, this is one of those examples. It sounds like they're already going to start covering Toyota. But this is where, as mentioned previously, Toyota and Honda are generally known for doing a good job and having reliable vehicles overall. And if you're going to charge a premium price and then have poor quality and then not even stand by fixing those issues in the long term, there's no reason for customers to stay loyal to you.
Toyota dealers, on the other hand, tell him that company has been better about issuing recalls and springing for repairs to preserve its reputation for quality, as it has done with its recent recall of 100,000 trucks and SUVs with potentially defective engines.
So the large majority of these motors are perfectly fine. But Toyota's saying, hey, we don't want there to be a perception of there being a problem.
Nissan also has instituted sales incentives that push dealers to sell cars aggressively, which is difficult to sustain over the long term and has a way of driving down resale values. It can also damage its reputation by creating resentful customers who had to shell out a lot more cash for a car than someone who shopped just a few weeks later.
Of course, Nissan is not the only automaker that refuses to fix cars out of warranty or the only one that introduces aggressive incentive programs.
The question is, how can I sell another car today, even if it costs me 2 sales tomorrow? Versus Toyota, which is, I care more about the 2 sales tomorrow, so I'm going to behave in a way that treats the customer and the dealer well today. And it's that difference in mindset that I think is the overall core reason why Nissan struggles compared to its peers.
Nissan's current position is reflected in the values of its dealerships. Toyota stores haven't fallen that much in value since the overall peak in 2023, whereas Nissan stores are a lot cheaper than the average. In fact, there might be a bigger difference between a Toyota and Nissan dealership than at any point Hague Partners has seen, according to its report. So, sales are depressed and products are stale. Meanwhile, Nissan faces intense competition from the Chinese, both in China and, increasingly, in emerging markets. In much of the rest of the world, it is being outrun by global rivals who themselves are facing increased Chinese competition.
At the end of the second quarter 2024, Nissan said it would slash global production by 20% and cut 9,000 jobs, about 7% of its workforce. CEO Makoto Uchida gave up 50% of his salary starting in November 2024. Other executive committee members are expected to follow, though details are unclear.
It is also shuffling executives. CFO Stephen Ma will now oversee the China business. America's boss Jeremy Papin will become the new global CFO. Christian Mounier will take on the Americas. Nissan declined CNBC's request for an interview. It said in a statement, among other things, that reports the company only has 12 to 14 months to survive are based on speculation and not on any announcement by the company. We continue to maintain strong levels of liquidity and are progressing with investments in new products and technologies. That
is a good point by them. That is a pretty sensational statement to make. And having worked at large companies before, especially large companies who have historically made a lot of money, have a lot of cash in the bank, you can last for a long time. Like, you can be a failing business for years and years, especially if you're staying on top of reducing your workforce, reducing your expenses, cutting products that aren't that profitable. You can basically dwindle to nothing over maybe 5-10 years if you're really choosing to go down that route. The only reason why they would fail in the next 6 to 12 months would be if they filed for bankruptcy or they had a lot of debts or they didn't have that much cash. And so this drop in revenue is something that's completely catastrophic for them. But most businesses keep cash on hand. This is basically an emergency fund for them. So that's just a personal finance type of concept where I would encourage you all to have it as well, which is sometimes you keep extra cash hanging around in your bank just for emergencies, because you don't know what's going to happen. Something could go wrong. You could get into an accident. You could lose your job, whatever it is. And companies do the same thing. They usually try to save a certain amount of cash in the bank to handle uncertainty that comes in the future. And so a lot of these big companies usually have a pretty sizable cash reserve, especially if they've had a lot of profits in the past. And so they can leverage this to kind of keep losing, but reduce how long it will take them before they run out of money by offsetting expenses, offsetting their burn, and trying to really stretch that fund as much as possible. So 6 to 12 months does seem sensationalized. Likely they are failing at this point in time, but they still have a chance to have a good product or two and maybe start to turn around. But they likely still have a few years, maybe even a decade or more, depending on how well they handle this transitioning point for them and how well they stay on top of their cash flow.
The biggest news is its possible merger with Honda. This would create the world's third largest automaker, with US market share comparable to that of Toyota and the Hyundai Motor Group. It would also provide an opportunity to share parts and research and development costs.
We hope that they will merge with Honda or perhaps Mazda, but more likely Honda, where together they would have comparable market share to Toyota or the Korean brands. I think that both brands would do better in the US marketplace and also be better positioned to survive against the Chinese, which is a major concern for all these OEMs outside of the US. I don't see the Chinese brands coming into the US for quite a while, but in other markets, they're there, and it's going to be hard to get them out.
What we used to see in the past, that the Western car makers went there and they taught the Chinese how to make cars. Now is the opposite.
Nissan does have some potential advantages. In a market where high prices are driving away consumers, the fact that Nissan has 6 models starting under $30,000 can attract customers alienated by still relatively high vehicle prices. It will need every tool it has.
Crisis 2025 we're gonna see one of the most serious crises since the last one we had in 2011, 2012.
We've been here before with Nissan, and I believe that the strength of Infiniti and Nissan are sufficient to survive this, particularly if they can get a partner.
Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, please hit like or subscribe. I'll see you around.